Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. If you've never seen me before, my name is Kirsty and I am here for you every single week with new true crime content, so I would definitely recommend subscribing. I'd actually never heard of this case before until I saw it going viral on TikTok, and when I started looking into it, I couldn't believe I'd never heard of it because it's actually Australia's most deadly mass shooting. Martin Bryant was born on the 7th of May 1967 in Hobart, Tasmania, Australia, and he went on to murder 35 people and injure a further 23 people. Martin was brought up with his parents, Maurice and Carleen Bryant, and he had a pretty normal childhood, but he was always described by everybody, including his parents, as just being different. His parents would always describe seeing broken toys a lot in the house, which isn't uncommon in itself. Toys can get broken, kids can be a little bit heavy-handed, but the amount was just a little bit different for a normal quote-unquote child. Neighbours would also describe Martin's behaviour as being abnormal when they'd see him out and about in the neighbourhood. He just didn't quite act how all the other children acted. Even his teachers at school would describe him as being distant and unemotional. It was just something that was picked up by pretty much every single adult around Martin in his early life. Not only was Martin quite distant at school and quite out of things and not really in the loop, he was also quite a bully as well. He would be disruptive during lessons rather than just sit quietly and listen, and he'd also have violent outbreaks as well with other children. Martin was suspended from school at one point and he had to undergo numerous psychological tests, and during one of these assessments it was actually noted down that it was known that he liked to torture animals. And I'm just saying, it's quite commonly known that serial killers and people who end up ultimately committing murder, a lot of the time they have experimented with things like hurting animals before they've progressed on to humans. So I'm not entirely surprised by learning that Martin was into that kind of thing when he was younger. After all the problems he had at his school, he was transferred to a different school that had a special educational unit, but unfortunately for Martin, it didn't really help, and his academics and his behaviour continued to deteriorate throughout the rest of his school year. Because of moving schools and his behaviour, he was never really able to make friends. He would sometimes try and make friends, but because of his behaviour and the way that he acted, he just never seemed to manage to make a friend, so he was always quite alone. In 1983, Martin was assessed for a disability pension because officials and school representatives all thought that when he finished school he wouldn't be able to hold down a job because of his capacity. They all thought he wouldn't be able to fit into a workplace. The doctor actually described Martin as being unemployable and that he would annoy people, which would cause him to get into a lot of trouble. And this is before he'd even really got into the world of work. He'd never even started it. So right before he even entered that, just at the end of school, he was already getting a disability pension because he wasn't going to be able to work. They could tell just from the way he'd grown up and the way he'd gone through school, he wasn't cut out for it. The doctor had also made a note in his report and said he cannot read or write, does a bit of gardening and watches TV. Only his parents' efforts that prevent further deterioration. Could be schizophrenic, and parents face a bleak future with him. So because of this glowing assessment from this doctor, he was actually granted a disability pension, but he did end up getting a little bit of work and he would garden for people and he'd also be a handyman. So he was able to hold down a bit of a job. It just wasn't kind of a reliable 9-to-5 job. It was more flexible to come and go with what he needed. In 1987, Martin was putting his name out there, spreading the word about his gardening services and trying to find out if anybody in the community wanted to hire him to do gardening for them, which is where he ended up meeting 54-year-old Helen Mary Elizabeth Harvey. At the time, Helen was living with her mother, but she was actually an heiress to a big lottery win, so she was kind of waiting on getting a massive lump sum of money. Helen and her mother's house was massive. It was basically a mansion, and her and Martin started to become friends. Martin was there quite a lot to tend to the garden because the garden was massive, and they also had so many animals and he would also kind of help out with that. There was actually 14 dogs and 40 cats apparently living in the garage, which I kind of think sounds like animal cruelty. But if they were allowed to roam in the mansion gardens, then that wouldn't be so bad. But still, 40 cats is a lot. Like, I've got one cat and he is enough, let me tell you. I know when you say that somebody's living in a mansion, you kind of assume it's going to be really grand and luxurious and just beautiful to live in, but it was a hazard. It was unclean, it was just dirty. It was quite literally a hazard, to the point where Helen and her mother's health was not doing too well, and so much so that health authorities actually took them both out of the house and sent them to hospital for a little while so that they could be treated because of their living conditions. Their house was literally making them ill. And Helen's mother actually ended up passing away a few months after this. Helen was able to recover in the hospital, and then she was able to leave and return back to the mansion. A cleanup order had been put on the mansion so that it needed to be sorted before anybody could go back to it and live in it. But nothing really official happened with it. So Maurice, Martin's dad, ended up going and completely doing up the house. He really took control of it. He cleaned the entire thing and just improved the living standards there. And by this point, because of everything that had gone on with the health authorities, all of the pets had actually been taken and they had gone into an RSPCA facility. So there was no longer hundreds of pets running around. So at this point, because Helen had come out of the hospital, she was back in the mansion, things were actually livable, she asked Martin to move in with her because they were really good friends at this point. They were kind of each other's best friend. They would go shopping together in town, they would go out for nice fancy lunches, they were just spending Helen's inheritance basically. She'd got all of this money now and she was living it large and taking Martin along for the ride with him, and he was thoroughly enjoying himself. Throughout all of this time and Martin living with Helen, he would still have to undergo regular assessments to maintain his disability pension money from coming in. So he would go and see these doctors and they'd make regular notes on his system so that they can kind of just maintain the fact that he still needed to have this pension and that he wasn't able to go out and work. And during one of his assessments at this time, the doctor wrote, "Father protects him from any occasion which might upset him as he continually threatens violence. Martin tells me that he would like to go around shooting people. It would be unsafe to allow Martin out of his parents' control." Clearly, Martin struggled a lot with his mental health and it wasn't unnoticed. It was literally written down in every single assessment. In 1991, Helen and Martin actually moved from the mansion to a little farm in a small township, and people in the neighbourhood quickly realised that Martin was a little bit unhinged. He would walk around the neighbourhood with an air gun and he would aim it at people and shoot just at neighbours that he would walk past. So he didn't really make the best first impression. Then, tragically, 1 year later in 1992, Helen was killed when her car veered into the wrong side of the road. Martin was in the car with her at the time and he sustained severe back and neck injuries and he ended up in the hospital for 7 months. At the time, it did become a police investigation because they had a feeling that Martin may have caused the accident, whether it was to gain full access to Helen's money or whether it was just because he was quite a wild personality. And it was actually known that before, in the past, he had lunged at Helen's steering wheel while they had been driving. They'd actually already had 3 car accidents before just from Martin doing this. So they'd just be driving down the road and Martin would reach over and pull at the steering wheel. So is it out of pocket to say that maybe he caused this by doing that because all of a sudden their car veered onto the wrong side of the road? I kind of think like it seems maybe he did have a hand in that. But he wasn't actually found guilty of it and he was the sole beneficiary of Helen's entire estate and he ended up being given 550,000 Australian dollars. But because of Martin's upbringing and the fact that it was on record to say that he didn't have capacity to, have a job, he didn't have like full capacity to be a citizen of the world, his parents actually ended up having like a financial order over him, so they were in control of the money and he would have to ask them if he needed anything. So he wasn't just able to go out and blow the whole $550,000. His parents looked after it for him. After Helen's passing, Martin ended up moving back in with his parents and Maurice actually took on the role of looking after the farm. They were planning to sell it, obviously, if no one was living there, but Martin's dad needed to do it up a little bit first, as he did with the mansion. He kind of took over that, looked after it and maintained it to the point where it was livable, and he kind of just needed to do that again for the farm. with the intention of selling it, and then obviously they would be able to keep the money. However, Martin's dad, Maurice, was actually really struggling with his mental health at this time, and nobody really knew about it. He was actually suffering really badly with depression at this time, and he had moved all of the joint accounts that he had with his wife. He moved them solely into her name. Then a few months after this, one of Maurice's friends hadn't seen him for a few days, so he took a trip up to the farm to just go and spend a little bit of time with him. But when he got there, he found that the farm was completely abandoned, and there was just a note that said, "Call the police." Obviously, the police were immediately called, and the whole property and the land surrounding it was thoroughly searched. But it wasn't until divers got involved to search a dam that was on the property that Maurice's body was found. He was found with a diving weight belt wrapped around his neck, and while the death was deemed to be unnatural by the police, it actually got ruled as a suicide. By this time, and over quite a short period of time, Martin had ended up acquiring quite a lot of money. He obviously had all of Helen's wealth that he'd got from being the sole beneficiary of her will. He'd got some money from his dad now that he had passed, and also from selling the farm as well. So Martin started spending his money. He started shopping and wearing really fancy clothes. He used to buy really nice shoes and take himself off to lunch all the time. He would kind of treat his new outfits and his fashion sense as a conversation starter, because obviously he never really had any friends, and he needed something to kind of get the conversation flowing with new people. So he'd wear things like bright powder blue suits that had ruffles all over it and snakeskin shoes, and he'd go to restaurants, and he'd go to the same kind of restaurant every single time and get like his regular table, and he'd always make conversation with people that were sat near him. But unfortunately, it kind of didn't go down too well, and people used to laugh at him because he would just be kind of awkward and people didn't really know how to react. Martin would really try and find situations where people couldn't leave from speaking to him. Like, he got to the point where he would take flights so that he would be trapped in a confined space with somebody, because obviously somebody can't just get off a plane. There isn't really anywhere you could go. If you're sat near someone, you're there for the duration of that flight. So he would book flights with the intention of trapping these people so that he would force them to have conversations with him. But these conversations would actually mean a lot to Martin, and he'd mention it during psychiatric evaluations, and when he would talk to people, he would always bring up these conversations that he'd had with various people. Despite all of his attempts to make friends with people, he felt really, really lonely, and by 1995 he'd actually become suicidal, and he just felt like the world was against him and that he could never build bonds with people, and he just felt like there wasn't really a way out. He'd also started drinking a lot of alcohol. He was drinking bottles of Sambuca, Bailey's, wine. He was just completely spiraling, and the alcohol did not help. Then, according to Martin, he actually spent the next 4 to 12 weeks making a plan of something that he really wanted to do, and this was a well thought out plan. He spent weeks developing it before he would finally go through with it. On the 28th of April 1996, Martin drove down to the Seascape guest house and he killed the owners. The owners were a couple called Sally and David Martin, and it's believed that the only reason that Martin went there that day to kill them was because his dad Maurice had actually wanted to buy the Seascape guest house once, but Sally and David bought it first. And Martin always believed deep down that the reason that Maurice started feeling depression and started going downhill was because he'd missed out the chance on buying the guest house, and that was what triggered it, and that is what ultimately led to his dad's passing. So Martin took it upon himself to get some kind of vengeance on them, because they're the ones that ended his dad's life. Even though they had no idea who Maurice was, they were not involved in his life in the slightest. They were just completely innocent owners of a guest house. He then left the Seascape guest house and drove down to Port Arthur. He went to a cafe there that was called the Broad Arrow Cafe, and he actually sat and had something to eat. And when he'd finished, he pulled a semi-automatic rifle out of his duffel bag and started opening fire. Within the next few minutes, 20 people had lost their lives. It was as quick as that. He literally took this gun out, and within minutes, so many lives were ended. There was no targets involved, there was nothing specific. After he'd gone to the seascape, it was just kind of going to be a massacre. He didn't know who he was going to be killing. He wasn't looking for anybody in particular. He would just spot somebody and aim. He aimed his gun at a woman who was walking down the street carrying her younger child and had her older child with them. Her and her younger child were killed pretty much immediately, and her older child actually ran away, but while she was running, Martin shot her too. He continued shooting at random people in the area. He then got into his car. He drove for a little bit, not very long, and then he found a BMW and he got out of his car and forced the driver of the BMW into the boot of the car, and then he shot the other passengers. He then returned back to the Seascape guest house where all of this started. Obviously by this point police are well aware of what is happening and they had managed to track Martin down. They got to the guest house and they tried negotiating with him, but Martin would just open fire on the police. Anybody who tried to interact with him, anybody that he saw, he would just shoot at and kill. They just ended up in a standoff and Martin was inside the guest house, the police were on the outside of the guest house, and they were just kind of trying to bide their time and figure out what to do. And then night passed and then the morning came, and when it got to the morning, Martin set fire to the guest house, and at the point when it was literally going to be burning down and Martin was going to lose his life, he escaped through the back exit of the guest house, which is where he ended up being caught by the police. Martin told the police that he had been surfing the day before. He didn't really even know that there was a shooting going on. He had no knowledge of it. He was completely unaware because he'd just spent the day surfing, even though there were so many eyewitnesses that could confirm that it was Martin. He tried to claim that he had no idea. He did, however, admit to stealing the BMW and forcing the driver of the BMW into the boot. And he then said that there was another couple of people in the car, a mother and a child, and that they'd got out of the BMW and gone into his car and driven off in that. So I'm not really sure why he admitted to stealing the BMW. Like, why would he think that that was something that he could say? Unless they had him on CCTV and he couldn't really get away with it. But still, it's a bizarre thing to deny the entire mass shooting but admit to stealing the car and putting the man in the boot. He then says that he drove this BMW to the Seascape guest house, and the reason he went there was to see some old acquaintances, Sally and David Martin, who owned the guest house. He tried to say that they were friends, like old friends, and he was just going around to see them, to visit, and obviously, you know, it set on fire and he had nothing to do with that. Investigators also questioned Martin on the fact that the BMW had been set on fire outside the Seascape guest house. And Martin said, "Oh, I don't really know what happened. I don't really know why that would be on fire. I must have been playing around with petrol." Like, he must have just forgot. He was just playing around with petrol and maybe it had set on fire and he didn't really know. It's, the mind just boggles me how people try and get out of situations like this and how they think, yes, the police are going to believe this. It truly baffles me every single time. Martin then told them that he felt awful that the hostage that he had in the boot of the car, the original driver of the BMW, that he must have passed away in the boot of the car because obviously it had set on fire accidentally while he was playing with petrol. And, you know, he felt terrible about it. But it was actually found that there were 3 victims' bodies found inside the Seascape, and I'm not sure whether or not, I mean, obviously that is Sally and David, the owners, but I think the 3rd body is maybe relating to him, as though maybe he had taken him out of the boot of the car and brought him into the house and he had died in that fire, or whether he'd shot him in the house, I'm not sure. The ending to this police interview is kind of what was going viral on TikTok. I will insert it because it's one of the most well-known clips surrounding this case.
In the police interview, there was one moment where Bryant dropped his guard. He thought they'd stopped recording.
I don't find that a very funny statement at all, mate, to be quite honest.
Should have put that on recording.
I'm still recording at this present stage, so that is on recording.
It was decided that Martin Bryant was fit to stand trial after initially pleading not guilty. He then changed his plea to guilty on all charges. Martin Bryant was sentenced to 35 life sentences plus 1,652 years in prison without the possibility of parole. This one case actually changed Australia's gun laws massively. They also put in like an amnesty kind of thing as well, where people could basically just give in their weapons if they had anything, even if it was like an illegal weapon that they weren't supposed to have. You could give it over to the police and they would melt it down, they would destroy it, and there was no repercussions for it. And over 600,000 weapons were handed in to the police just because of that, which I actually think is amazing, that a country can have one major incident and change a law and have so many weapons handed in because of it. I feel like some other countries that we know of that have mass shootings could really do with doing something similar, because it's just amazing that the government was like, we need to do something about this. We can't let this happen more than once. So that is the case of Australia's most deadly massacre, and I could not believe that I had never heard of it before until I saw that famous interview clip on TikTok. But if you've got any case suggestions, please let me know in the comments. I would love to know what you want to see. And as usual, I will be here next week. Bye.